This episode of Warbird Tube is brought to you in part by Aviation Discovery Fest. Celebrate the spirit of freedom as Aviation Discovery Fest returns to Dallas October 4th through the 6th. Experience world-changing vintage aircraft and military vehicles. See living history with authentic reenactors and pay honor to the veterans of the greatest generation. Plus, you can take flight with living history flight experiences. Be sure and get your tickets today at aviationdiscoveryfest.org.
Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube. This is episode 169, and if you watch a lot of our episodes, you will know that I'm not your host, Steve Buss today. Steve Buss, as many of you know, he is an announcer at EAA AirVenture in Oshkosh, and he's still recovering from that excellent job he did. So tonight, I will be your host, Leah Block. I'm the head of marketing over at the Commemorative Air Force headquarters. And also joining me as a co-host is Rick Bell. He's a longtime member. He's active in many, many units and is also a pilot and a friend. I thank Rick very much for coming on. One of the reasons I wanted Rick to come on the show today is because when we did an episode with him a couple months back, he was talking about an L5 his unit is restoring and to the livery of a first Air Commando. And as he was telling this story, he recommended a book and said, this is really the book that if you want to know about the First Air Commandos, this is the book that you should watch. So our producer very diligently found the author of that book, and we're really excited to have him on the show tonight. Before we get started, we've got a couple of housekeeping things. There's lots of ways you can watch and listen to these episodes. You can register, you can watch them on YouTube. You can also listen to them on your favorite podcast. Just search for CAF Warbird Tube and you'll find us. There's another thing you could do if you really like the episodes. We hope that you like, subscribe, and share them with your friends so we can get some more viewers. This show is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. You can learn more about the Commemorative Air Force and what shows are coming up just by going to the website commemorativeairforce.org. So if you are watching the show live, you can use the chat feature and you can send us a question. If you're watching it on YouTube or Facebook or someplace else, if you put something in the comments, we'll also get back to you. It just might not be as quick. So feel free to add your comments and suggestions and things like that. So now that I've got that taken care of and out of the way, we will get to tonight's show. Welcome, gentlemen. We are here with Ralph and with Rick, and I'm going to turn it over to Ralph so that he can let us know who he is and why he's interested in this topic.
Ralph Van Wagner, former military, spent 30 years in the Air Force, son of a first Air Commando, and that's the reason that I got interested in this story. My dad very rarely talked about his time in Burma, so when I had an opportunity to visit the Historical Research Center at Maxwell, I looked up the information, was able to compile a pretty good story on what they were doing and presented it to the First Air Commando Association. And it came out as a published book, both from the school there at Maxwell and also through Schiffer Publishing. So
awesome.
Let's start talking about the First Air Commandos in World War II. The genesis of the First Air Commandos can be traced back to December of 1941, not only because we not only because of Pearl Harbor, but also because we're on the wrong slide. Go back. Okay. Not only because of Pearl Harbor, but also because during December of 1941, the Japanese launched attacks in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, and also in the small country of Burma. There are situations, there are terrain, there's circumstances that occurred in Burma that required a new type of aerial warfare. With that new type of aerial warfare, the traditionalist took a look at it, and as B.H. Little Hart said, the hardest thing to get out, to getting a new idea into a military mind is to get the old one out. And so you will see that that the historians don't necessarily record a lot of the information about the 1st Air Commandos. First of all, they were in the China-Burma-India Theater. That's the patch in the upper left-hand corner. The China-Burma-India Theater is probably little known. If anybody talked about theaters in World War II, they talked about the European theater or the Pacific theater. Some may mention the Mediterranean theater, but the China-Burma-India Theater was pretty much forgotten, not only forgotten by historians in the US, but somewhat forgotten in terms of resources to that theater. So you're going to see that throughout this story. Next slide. To understand what was going on, the Japanese expansionism began in 1937. They set up something called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, in which they looked at countries that were ruled by colonial powers. And they said that the Japanese should, they're smarter than everybody else, and they should be in control of that area, and they should be able to help those countries really develop themselves. And so in 1937, they entered Manchuria. They continued on to China, Indonesia, Southeast Asia. In particular, in Southeast Asia, they looked at Burma. They also looked at Singapore. All of those were required, as far as they were concerned, because they offered resources. The resources in Burma, for example, were manganese that they could use for military reasons. There were oil fields. They thought that Burma also would be a launching pad for them to go into India. India offered a number of industries, the chemical industry, the munitions industry. So there were many reasons for them to do that. As for a food supply, as the Japanese were expanding their influence, they needed a food supply, and Burma was very important to that. They had millions of acreage in rice. They exported rice, and the Japanese needed that to continue their quest. They went to Singapore because Singapore offered the opportunity to block approaches to the main island of Japan. So there were reasons why the Japanese were going into Burma. Next slide. As they went into Burma, they very quickly ran the British and the Chinese out of there, to the point where now we were concerned about the fact that they could go into India. India offered a potential population that was interested in getting rid of the British overlords. So we had a problem now. China was being threatened because what we needed to do in China was to keep them in the war. It was a part of the Pacific plan that we needed to have the 25 Japanese divisions that were in China doing civil rest to keep those Japanese divisions from being released into the Pacific. So we had sent, prior to 1941, we sent some of our pilots to fly for the Flying Tigers, the American Volunteer Group. The idea there was that pilots would leave the US, they would go to China, They would fight for the Chinese, and if we got into the war, and we did, they would return without losing their seniority, without losing their rank, and they would join the US forces. The task that we had was, if we wanted to keep those 25 Japanese divisions tied up, we had to be able to continue to supply munitions, equipment, provisions, everything for China to stay in the war. We did that through the Burma Road. When the Japanese took Burma and virtually ran us out of there, they now controlled the southern terminus of the Burma Road. So the solution became, we will fly supplies to China over the hump, a very inefficient way of getting all of that to China. So we had a problem. The British wanted to reclaim their territories, their colonies. We wanted to keep the Chinese in the war. So Burma became a kind of center point for all of those objectives. Next slide. You have to understand, Burma presented a lot of issues that had to be addressed, and they couldn't be addressed through normal, traditional military operations. First of all, Burma was surrounded virtually by mountainous rim. In order to get through Burma, you had to go over the mountains to get to the mainland part of Burma. If you looked at Burma also, it was kind of like a waterfall. Everything flowed north to south. The waterways, of which there were three major waterways. Number one would be the Irrawaddy, which ran right through the center of the country. There was one that came out of the northwest that was the Chinwin, and the Salween was over here on the eastern border. The rails all followed the waterways, and the roads did the same. So to move from east to west or west to east was almost impossible. It was against the nature of Burma itself. And so now you had this problem of, how do we get there, and then how do we sustain ourselves? Once we got there, the Allied forces, the British and the Americans, would have to fight a jungle warfare. They would have to be subjected to the diseases, malaria, and the like in the country. So that presented one problem. Next slide.
So did they know ahead of time that there were going to be these challenges before they went to the country? Was there anything that they could do to prepare them for it, or when they got there, they just had to figure it out?
Okay, there was an individual, and he'll be about 3 slides down. There was an individual who studied this entire situation, looked at the Japanese military operations, their tactics, their culture, their religion. He looked at the topography. He looked at the situation in Burma, and he came up with a plan, but it was an unorthodox plan. Next slide. In addition to the topography, there was weather phenomena as well. Burma was subjected to monsoons. From May to October, there was so much rain that came into Burma, in some cases over 100 inches. The smallest amount was in the central part, and it was almost 50 inches of rain that they were subjected to. What it did is it turned these roads and these forest jungles into mud and mire. And so it was almost difficult, almost impossible to do a military operation. So what you saw was they ran an operation until about mid-May, and then they would just kind of go on hold, doing some operations as they could, but they couldn't really mount some sustained operation. So they picked it up again in October. So you had October to May to really do your operation, and then you kind of stalled out. So it's a very difficult situation to overcome. Next slide. This is the individual we were talking about, and Rick knows something about him. Very eccentric. He was known to conduct staff meetings in the nude. He ate raw onions. He carried an alarm clock around his neck, but he thought very much outside the box, and he was the one who did the extensive analysis of everything that was going on in Burma. He did that while the British were being run out, and he decided that what he needed to do is he needed to train his troops to be able to operate in jungle conditions. And so he set up training camps that were very rigorous, working his troops, making them run back and forth, working out how they would survive in the jungle. And he proposed something that he called long-range penetration. He said that the interior defenses were very weak. Once you got past the perimeter defenses that the Japanese had set up, the troops inside were not well organized and they weren't really very good troops. And so he said, if I have a mobile unit, I can do surprise attacks. I can take a look at some of the things that are important to us as allies. I can attack their lines of communications where roads, railroads, and rivers come together. If I can control them, if I can damage the bridges, if I can stop the trains, then I can delay or deny supplies going to the front. And so he reasoned that I can do that if I have a way of getting supplies to my men while we're in Burma. And so he set up a way, proposed a way that aerial resupply would be the way that he would get his provisions. What he said was, I can't bring in all of the supplies. I have pack mules that bring my communication gear. I've got my people who are essentially marching into Burma. But in order to get my supplies, I need to bring in the goods, he said, like Father Christmas down the chimney. And so he proposed aerial resupply. He also said, I don't have any way to bring in some heavy artillery. I can bring mortars, but that's about it. I need the firepower that aerial combat can bring to me. And so he proposed that he have some fighters and bombers who could respond to his needs on short notice. He found out that that was not as forthcoming as he hoped, but we'll see in the next slide what became of this. Okay. What he proposed was to become a part of a major offensive called Anakin. He said, if my units are behind the lines doing hit and run type tactics, I need some sort of major offensive to take the focus off of us and put it on a force on force operation. That was Anakin. Anakin was a complex, coordinated offensive that included a foray down the coast of Burma, another foray that went into the central part of Burma by the British, and then the Chinese were going to come from the north. And all of this was intended to be able to take over the northern part of Burma. He said, if I'm going to do this, what we found out in my training exercises is I need a way to be able to talk to the pilots in the airplanes who will understand the language. So he said, assign me an RAF liaison to each one of my columns, and I can now tell them where to set up a drop zone or where to target the troops that are encroaching upon me, approaching me. And so he got all that set up. The problem was that Anakin failed. It just fell apart. The attack down the Burma coast didn't even get started. They didn't get very far before they turned back. There were transportation problems getting the British across the mountains, the Chinwen Hills. And then the Chinese looked at the whole thing and said, I'm out of here. And so it looked like the whole thing would be canceled. Wingate argued, no. Although I need a major offensive, I still want to do LRP. My people are motivated. They're trained. I'll never get this opportunity again. Let me do an operation and show you what LRP can do. So they gave him Operation Longcloth. And what he found was the things that they had worked out for airdrop were very successful. He was able to disrupt rail and river traffic. As you can see in some of the pictures right there, they're dealing with bridges. They're dealing with rail traffic, and they're able to disrupt that. And they were very successful in it until they went too far into Burma. And when they went so far into Burma, now the airlift couldn't keep up with them. couldn't go that deep. So they became the focus of the Japanese because they didn't have the major offensive, and they also were lacking now resupply. And so they broke up into small units, and they came back to India. He went in with 3,000. He came out with 2,182. They were virtually non-capable of continuing to be a combatant. They were so wrung out. In addition to that, the morale of the men was high because they had brought force against the Japanese, but also there was a part of that the morale suffered, and that was when a person couldn't keep up with the moving columns, very mobile columns, then there wasn't anything that they could do except to leave him. Maybe they left him with a canteen, with grenades, with a rifle. Sometimes they gave him a Bible and a little sign that says, "I'm a non-combatant, treat me accordingly." But they pretty much knew that if they left the guy behind, that he was either going to be dead or he was going to become a prisoner of war. Neither one of them was a good outcome.
Wow.
Next slide. So the good thing about Operation Longcloth is they did show that they could take the fight to the Japanese. It was, in fact, the only operation in that theater that was any kind of success. Everybody had heard about Anakin falling apart. And so Churchill found out about this, brought Wingate back, talked to him, and took him to the Quadrant Conference. Wingate's men were called Chindits. That's actually a mispronunciation of a chinti, which is this half griffin, half lion that was outside the pagodas in Burma. It was approved that they would do a second special force and reopen the Burma Road. The only thing is that Wingate said, "I can't do this unless I have some way of getting my wounded out of the theater." And so it was turned over. Churchill talked to Roosevelt. Roosevelt then talked to General Arnold, told Arnold, "We're going to do this." And so he turned it over to him. At the same time that the Quadrant Conference was going on, the Japanese were looking at what Wingate had done behind the lines. They realized that they were vulnerable. And so they began planning something called Operation U-Go, and it was going to be a preemptive attack across the Chin Hills into the eastern part of India to attempt to take over a major storehouse at Dimapur. So we had two things going on. You got a second operation going on, and you got the Japanese doing a preemptive offensive. Next slide. The responsibility for getting small, light planes was given to Arnold. He came up with Project 9, and he was looking for commanders for Project 9. He looked at 5 people. He picked out 2 of them. Both of them were fighter pilots. One of them was Phil Cochran. Phil Cochran was very cavalier. He was very charismatic. He was aggressive, very likable, could get people to do almost anything. He had some experience in the African campaign. In fact, he found himself in a situation where he outranked the squadron commander that he came in as a replacement for. So he announced that he was now the squadron commander and began fighting the Germans in the deserts. He had a distinguished war record. What Arnold didn't know was Phil Cochran was also the character Flip Corkin in a Milton Caniff cartoon called Terry and the Pirates. So he was very charismatic. On the other hand, he had another one that came in who was John Allison. And John Allison was almost the opposite of Phil Cochran. He was an engineering graduate from the University of Florida. He was very tactful. He was diplomatic, could get things done because he was such a likable guy. I met him. I never heard him say anything unkind about anybody. Just a real gentleman. He had been involved in the Lend-Lease program in Russia. He was taking P-40s that were crated up. He would put them back together. He would test fly them, and then he would teach the Russians how to fly them. When he got relieved from that, and that's a story in itself, he was then sent to China to fly with the Flying Tigers. He became an ace, and at the time that he was called forward by General Arnold for an interview about this new Project 9, he was about to go to Europe with a group. And so they show up, and each one of them is interviewed by General Arnold. General Arnold liked both of them, saw characteristics in either one of them that he liked. And so he asked Phil Cochran if he wanted to take the job, and Phil said, no, give it to John. So he talks to John, says, you want the job? And John says, no, give it to Phil. Neither one of them wanted it. And so Arnold finally said, look, I want you to actually take back Burma by air. So go out and fight. Forget about the paperwork. He said it in a little bit different way, but he said, forget about the paperwork, go out and fight. So he made them co-commanders. So you got this Project 9 that is going to be special operations, and now you got this leadership that's co-command. They realized over time that really wasn't going to work, so Phil Cochran became the de facto commander, with John Allison being his deputy. But they were very instrumental because they were outside the box thinkers. But John Allison was the one who could take that outside the box thinking and turn it into something that would work. Next slide. They were told that they were supposed to come up with light planes. So they had a light plane section. Immediately, Phil Cochran flew to England and sat down with Wingate and said, okay, what are you doing and how can we help? He came out of that meeting realizing that this was more than light planes. And so he said, the British don't need to support you with a transport section. I'll get some C-47s. I'll get a UC-64 Norseman, which was a Bush pilot that the Canadians used. He also heard about a YR-4 helicopter that he called Egg Beater. He put Allison in charge of diplomatically getting that approved for an operational test in Burma. So he got 6 of them. Actually, two were damaged en route. 2 of them never flew. So he had 2 of them to work with, and I've got a separate section on that. He also said that if we're going to move a bunch of troops around, instead of having them march in, why don't we take them in with gliders? And so he commissioned some CG-4A gliders. He also got a training glider. He had a fighter section. He asked for P-38s. He ended up getting P-51s. He asked for 30 some odd. He got 13. Later on, after they arrived in Burma, they realized that the communication between ground troops and bomber pilots from the RAF just wasn't going to work. So he actually commandeered some B-25H models. My dad actually flew in as a B-25 pilot, and he literally took his airplane away from him, gave the fighter pilots the responsibility to fly those airplanes because he wanted to use them in a different way than normal bombers. And so my dad got reassigned within the 1st Air Commandos back to the light plane section, and he flew UC-64s, and he also flew some Sentinels and Vigilants. He didn't fly the lighter airplanes so much as he flew the UC-64. Okay, so now we got this group, we got this armada that's ready to support Wingate. And one of the things that Cochran said is, we're going to support them no matter what it takes. He had this phrase that my dad came back with, and it was, the difficult we do right away, the impossible takes a little time. And the idea was, whatever they want, we're going to get it for them. Next slide. So the operational plan originally is that Wingate was going to march his people into the middle part of Burma. And Cochrane listened to that, and he said, I think we got a better idea. I've got some gliders. We'll fly you in. You don't have to march for a week and a half to get yourself to an objective area in the center of Burma. I'll fly you in there. We'll do it in over a week. Admiral Mountbatten, who is now the head of something called SEAC, Southeast Asia Command, he looked at Cochrane and said, you are a breath of fresh air. And so that was approved at the same time that Cochrane was saying, we're going to go in, we're going to convert some jungle clearings into airfields. Wingate was looking at what he learned from Operation Longclaw, and he said, you know, we'd be better off, instead of doing hit and run tactics, if we can set up a stronghold and fortify it and get firepower to protect us while we're there. We can sit on roads, rail, and river crossings, and we can keep all the supplies from going forward. So he proposed strongholds. What it all came out to was they were going to build a hub and spoke type airfield. They were going to have a larger airfield, which we'll call Broadway in this particular case. You'll see that there were others. And we'll also build smaller airfields at the strongholds. The strongholds would be supplied by UC-64s or the L series, whereas Broadway would become the one that they would use to fly in a C-47 or in a UC-64 and bring in larger packages. What the first Air Commandos were to provide out of this was the airlift to resupply. They were still going to have to supply some moving columns, but for the most part, they were going to be supplying the strongholds. And they were supposed to supply close air support. And that's where they really made their money. That's where the strongholds were able to be operational, was if the Chindits called in P-51, called in a B-25 because there was enemy on the doorstep, they were accurate enough with what they were doing that they could keep the enemy away. Next slide. How do you make all this happen? Well, the concept was we're going to go 80 gliders into 2 different locations. We're going to go into a place called Broadway, and we're going to another place called Piccadilly, named after, we're going to do double toe. So double toe, they're bringing in these airplanes, and they're going to land at Broadway, and they're going to land at Piccadilly. Those 2 names were selected because they were the major thoroughfares in London and in New York City. They would fly in, establish a perimeter defense. They would have engineering equipment in this first wave of gliders. They would then carve out a jungle airfield, and they would use that as a major resupply point. So they would bring in the troops. The troops would go off into the jungle and go establish their strongholds. In the meantime, they would be supplying through this major airfield. That major airfield turned out to have all kinds of things. They had a cook. They had a kitchen area. They even had a chicken farm. So they were really secure. And it's kind of interesting in that the Japanese really didn't find Broadway. They never found it. They did launch a couple of attacks, but they were all repelled, and they never came back to it. So they were able to operate 200 miles behind the enemy lines with a major supply hub. Next slide. The one problem that they had was if we bring these gliders in and we're supplying that to a moving column, is the pilot in the glider going to now have to go with the units and go fight, or can we reclaim the pilot and the glider? There was a system that Richard DuPont set up to pick up mail without landing. And what he did is he set up these poles, and they had a loop, and he attached the loop to a mail bag. He had a hook that hung from the bottom of the airplane. It had an inertial reel inside, and he would come down and he would snag that loop, and he would pick up the bag of mail. And Cochrane, Allison, and some of the transport pilots said, you know, that would probably work with gliders as well. And so what they did is they established these gliders in the jungles of Burma. And next slide. They would fly a C-47 in, snag that thing, and lift him off the ground. He was 500 feet behind in 3 seconds. They actually showed this to Wingate one time. He sat there and went through what we call a snatch. And he was reading the book, and he continued to read the book. Next slide. So this was the way that they were going to get their equipment back. Now, what they had to do is they had to train to this. And so they had some air-ground coordination going on. They showed how they were going to do a glider infill. They loaded up the gliders. They showed them how you went about. You didn't actually walk around the gliders that much. You had to stay on certain portions of the glider that was reinforced. Otherwise, you would fall through the canvas, because that's all the glider was wooden canvas. Robert Smith was flying, and he blew the top off of a building. And Wingate was just ecstatic. He thought that was great. They got him back on the ground. Wingate goes away. They come and talk to Smith, and he said, I only missed it by a couple 100 yards. I was aiming at a warehouse. But the demonstration was such, and Smith admitted later on, he said they got really good at this. They got better and better at it. They could hit something at 1,500 or 250 yards just by the way they sighted the 75 millimeter cannon. The other concern, and I think Rick talked about this, was the L pilots were somewhat concerned about how survivable are we. We are unarmed. We are not unafraid, we're unarmed. And we'd like to know that we can survive if the Japanese come in and attack us. So Paul Forsey, one of the P-51 pilots, said, let me show you. So he got into an L5. We had another P-51 pilot fly, and they flew against each other using the maneuverability of the L5, the speed differential, and the fact that the L5 could virtually fly on treetops. Paul Forsey showed that the gun camera never was able to sight in on the L5. So now you had everybody believing that this was a great operation, and the morale was sky high. So what do we do next? Slide. So what they did is they did a combined operation in February. They did a night rehearsal. They demonstrated transportation of mules. They were concerned about the mules. They didn't know if they would start kicking, and if they kicked through the canvas, then potentially the glider was at risk. So Alan Hall was the pilot of the glider. He was an old guy from Missouri. He knew mules, so they tied down the ears of the mules so that they didn't get in the control wires that ran on the top of the glider. They loaded up the mule. They had stalls for them, and Hall was instructed that if in fact the mule was not cooperative, he was just to shoot him. So Hall takes him up, and he comes back down, and they said, "How did you do?" And he said, "They bank in turns." So the mules were not a problem. There was a glider crash, though, during this demonstration in which 4 British were killed and 3 U.S. were killed. It threatened the operation. Some of the leadership, not necessarily the 1st Air Commando leadership, but some of the British leadership began to ask, should we continue on with this? Is this going to work? And the commander of the unit that lost the British came back with a note, and he said, please be assured that we will go with your boys any place, anytime, anywhere. It kind of showed the camaraderie, the trust that they had in each other. It became the motto of the 1st Air Commandos. They somewhat have that same motto. They've modified it a little bit, but it became the catchword for this entire operation. We'll go with you any place, anytime, anywhere. So they were ready to go now. Next slide. So they were given an operation. It was called Operation Thursday. It was going to go off on a Sunday. Why not? It was going to be an airlift show. Most operations, in fact, all operations up until that time, you always started out kinetically. In this particular case, it was going to be a C-47 lead with a double glider tow. There was a late change. What Cochrane did is at the last minute, he sent up a reconnaissance B-25 to take pictures of the two locations that they were supposed to go into, Broadway and Piccadilly. What they found was Piccadilly had logs laid out in a somewhat pattern that would have made that a death trap. And so now the leadership had to figure out, do the Japanese know about this operation? Have they spoiled Piccadilly and left Broadway open so that they can now be waiting for us at Broadway? And there was a contingent who said, yeah, that may be the case. Others said, no, they probably realized that Piccadilly was used in Longcloth, and maybe they just did that so that we couldn't use Piccadilly. Long story short, what they decided was, we're going to go. We're going to direct everything to Broadway. They began the execution. The conditions at Broadway looked to be good, and so they directed everything to go that way. The gliders themselves, they got off 63 gliders, but en route, some of them were so overloaded because the Chindits took extra ammo, extra supplies. If you were going into the jungle, you didn't know when you were going to be supplied again, you'd do the same thing. So they loaded up the gliders. Some of them were too heavy, and they couldn't get over the Chin Hills. Others, because as you fly double tow, there's a lot of jockeying that goes on, and there's a lot of skill involved, and tow ropes broke. And in some cases, these gliders came down behind enemy lines and actually created somewhat of a diversion, in that the Japanese interpreted that as an invasion. But the conditions at Broadway were such that they went ahead and launched those. 37 of them arrived at Broadway. Next slide. At Broadway, this was the landing procedure at Broadway. What they did is they created the diamond out of smudge pots. You may have to go next slide. I think you kick it off. They set up smudge pots in a diamond. The center portion was a dividing line between the flanker lights that created two runways. So now you had two runways for the double tow. The gliders came in. They were then going to push the gliders off, and the second wave of gliders came in. That was the idea. That's what they thought they could do. Next slide. It didn't exactly work that way. What happened was everything worked as we thought. The first group that came in fanned out and set up a perimeter defense. Colonel Allison, who was on the second glider, he had never flown a glider before, but he was a consummate pilot. This can't be hard. And so he flew in, took over the operations at Broadway. What he found out was the photographs didn't show that there were some deep ruts all throughout Broadway. And so they also had an additional problem. As gliders came down and landed, these deep ruts would shear off the landing gear. So now you can't push them off to the side. In addition to that, there was supposed to be comm gear coming in. One of them didn't make it. The other one, when it arrived, was damaged. So they had no way to communicate, hey, things are not what we expected at Broadway. There were two code words. One of them was pork sausage, and the other one was soya link. Pork sausage, something that the British liked for breakfast, was to say everything's fine, continue the flow. Soya link was an artificial breakfast meal that the British hated, and it meant, something's wrong, stop the flow, let's be done with this. Problem was they couldn't send that until sometime around 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning. So what was happening was what Allison did to overcome the fact that he couldn't land everybody on the same landing field was, because he couldn't push the gliders out of the way, he moved the smudge pots. And so he's running back and forth all through the night, moving the smudge pots, landing landing the gliders, then moving the smudge pots again. So he's exhausted. And finally, they're able to get Soyalink across at like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. And so all of the gliders that are en route are told to return to base. And all of them did, except one. Allison's almost asleep, and he hears this glider coming in. Glider landed and immediately went between two trees, sheared off the wings. And if you noticed in the slide before, the front part of a glider actually raises. The pilot had rigged it so that if anything happened, that front part would raise. There was a bulldozer on board. It shot out the front. Yeah. The front then closes, broke the thumb of the pilot, but the bulldozer was not damaged. So Cochran then gets a hold of a Lieutenant Brackett and says to him, "How long is it going to take for you to make this an airfield?" Lieutenant, being a lieutenant, looks at a colonel and says, "If I have it done this afternoon, is that too late?" Obviously it wasn't. They began to arrive that night, and they flew in sortie after sortie after sortie of C-47s. They had leveled Broadway to the point where they had, I think it was 4,500-foot runway that the C-47s could operate out of. It was going so well that Colonel Cochran Colonel Allison sent back a message saying, "LaGuardia has nothing on us." Over that time period, next slide. Over that time period, in essentially what amounted to 6 days, they were able to move over 9,000 personnel, 1,458 animals, most of which were mules. One was a horse. Nobody knows how the horse got in this whole thing. Somebody had to know, but nobody admitted it. Allison was running around back and forth, and finally one of the Chindits came up and said, "Sir, would you like a horse?" Sure. So he gets a horse. They also moved 250 tons of cargo into Broadway in that time period, all with C-47s. As the Chindits arrived, they moved off into the jungle and they began to set up their strongholds. Next slide. What happened was, now Wingate has moved his troops from Broadway to his strongholds. He had two major ones. When he started, he set up a third one that really didn't work. White City and Aberdeen. They named it White City because we were dropping supplies and provisions by parachutes into White City, and they hung in the trees so much they would cut the supplies off of the parachutes, and the parachutes would be there. So it virtually looked like a White City. So they were moving things into the strongholds. The fighters and bombers were now on call to go support the Chindits. The Chindits set up a perimeter defense with barbed wire, and they began to choke off the supplies going to the front. The P-51s, B-52 or B-25s were there to provide that close air support. They also got support somewhat from light airplanes as they flew in, because if the light airplanes saw enemy approaching or enemy encampments, they would mark them, and the P-51s and B-25s would come in and attack. They also were responsible for setting up air superiority. To do that, they attacked aircraft on the ground, in the air, and they attacked locomotives and truck convoys that were moving around Burma. So they were very busy at this time, on call all the time. Next slide. What the transports were doing at this time was the C-47s were moving stuff behind enemy lines. They were landing at Broadway, and they would then hone their airdrop procedures and accuracy while supporting the Chindits. The Chindits would mark an area to to have a drop made at this location. What they found was if they used parachute drops, that they were not as accurate as a free fall. So they would repackage the supplies. They got food, they got shoes, they got clothing, they got medical supplies, they got all of those things, and they packaged them in such a way that for the most part, if it was a small location, then they would free fall it. Otherwise, they could use airdrop. It became the lifeline for these mobile columns and for these strongholds. They also, when they went into a stronghold, they would set up a small airfield for the L pilots to move in and out of, and the UC-64s could use those as well. There was a YR-4 helicopter that conducted the first helicopter rescue. Carter Harmon was the pilot of that particular mission. What they found was the helicopter was grossly underpowered, particularly for the humid conditions and the elevations that they had to experience in Burma. But they were able to essentially go in jumps to the location where they had a downed airman and able to pick him up. They tested and they approved the concept, but they sent word back that Sikorsky was going to have to beef up the power on that thing. Otherwise, it wasn't useful in Burma. It might be useful some other place. But certainly that was something that opened the door to what we now have for helicopters operating in support of special operations. Next slide.
Do you think at this point, is Japan aware of what's going on? Are they, I mean, it seems like a huge flurry of activity and chaos is happening, kind of, no one's honing in on it?
That's a good question. They did attack the strongholds, but don't forget, they've got Operation U-Go that they're planning. And so they are somewhat focused on a frontal attack to the west of where the Chindits are operating. And so, yes, they were somewhat aware of it, but they didn't have the resources now to be able to respond to those kind of attacks. There were light attacks that were repelled, and so the strongholds pretty much held up. The only time that they were able to close down a stronghold was when they opened up one called Blackpool, and Blackpool was in the wrong place. Everybody kind of knew it, and it didn't last. So yes, they were able to see what was going on, but I don't think they had the resources to be able to respond properly to it. Okay, light planes. The light planes were going all over the place. They were transporting personnel, official orders, delivering mail. You don't know what mail meant to people when they're in the field. A morale booster that you just can't put a price tag on. They did food bundles. They evacuated the wounded. It was said that if a person was wounded in Burma, they could be in a hospital in India overnight. And so that was the kind of responsiveness that the L pilots were able to do. They delivered medical supplies. All of the Chindits, all of the leaders of the Chindits, the unit, the column commanders, were all trained to do some sort of medical techniques and some sort of medical procedures. Certainly light, but if someone was sick, someone had an injury, they were able to treat it. So medical supplies were important to get into the moving columns. When they had someone who was injured, when they had someone who got sick, the L pilots would, and particularly the UC-64s, would move in replacements and escort people out, bring them back in. They did those reconnaissance flights that we talked about, where they could mark a location. In some cases, they would drop grenades on that same location, but mostly they used smoke bombs. And they could tell them, I dropped the smoke bomb. It's probably about 50 yards from there towards this tree line. And the P-51s and B-25s were able to come in and do some pretty good damage. They identified those enemy targets, and they returned captive prisoners. And when they found documents, they were able to bring them back. And so they were all over the place, doing things that I think Rick talked about this before. Light airplanes were never thought of very highly, and yet they were absolutely important to this operation, to keeping it going and to keep the morale going and to keep them supplied. Next slide.
Yeah, we have one of our viewers said that it's amazing because while they're having issues with the helicopter, Sikorsky's, inventing just exactly what they need at the moment that they need it. It's just, timing was just off.
It was interesting because when Cochrane sent Allison to get the helicopters, he was told no. And Allison, in the way that Allison did things, he said, look, you need to test these. We've got an operation that can use these. Let's combine the test with the operation. And so it was an operational test as opposed to a developmental test. And we found out so many things about the helicopter and doing it that way.
Wow.
Okay, next slide. Now I think we're going to get to your question, which was why didn't they approach Wingates and his people? Unfortunately, what happened was before this operation really showed that Wingate's ideas were spot on and were successful, we lost Wingate. Wingate went back into inspect to talk to some of his commanders. He came out in the B-25, and the B-25 crashed into a mountain, and he died before all of this was finished. But certainly his ideas were carried out to this portion. After he died, the command went to a more traditional commander, and they no longer operated exactly the way that Wingate wanted. But he was successful in this offensive, this Japanese offensive. General Mataguchi was in charge of the 15th Army. He launched Yugo. The objective was to get to Dimapur, and I don't know if you can see Dimapur, but Dimapur is up here. Dimapur is here, and they launched the attack with 21 days worth of supplies. They got to a couple of small villages, Imphal and Kohima, and they attacked them. What happened, though, was Imphal and Kohima were able to repel that attack, and so a siege was set up around these two villages. The interesting thing about it is that Japanese had 21 days worth of supplies. They set up a siege. Over that siege, what happened was the two villages were actually able to get supplies and food while the Japanese starved. So who was sieging who? What happened is that Special Force was sitting between this attack and the supplies back here at the rail stations and the supply routes. And so they sealed off the logistics tail. And what Wingate said would happen is there was nothing going forward. There were no supplies, there was no ammo, there was no food. And so here we had a siege going on, and the siege actually worked in the favor of the two villages that were surrounded by Japanese. Next slide. So what happens? Operation Yugo kind of rushed the Japanese timetable. General Mataguchi told his 15th Army commanders, I want you to fight. I want you to fight until the death. And they said, no, we can't. We have nothing to fight with. You've sent nothing to us. So Mataguchi says, I'm going to court-martial you. And one of the commanders came back and said, go ahead and try that. I'll get you court-martialed. And so Operation Yugo failed. It became the springboard for the British Army to chase the Japanese back out of India into Burma, and because they had gotten no supplies, because they were in such a weakened condition, it just kind of, I guess, just rolled up on itself. And so they were swept away. The Japanese turntail got out of Burma. It was the first land battle lost by the Japanese. As a result, virtually every commander in the Japanese 15th Army, with the exception of one who committed suicide, was fired. It went back up as far as the Tojo cabinet, and there was a shakeup within the cabinet. So this indirect approach that the Chindits were operating and the 1st Air Commandos were supporting had an effect on a battle that most people don't really understand. It was so unusual. The British, the traditional British, didn't give the Wingate operations, I think, their just dues. And so you won't find the British talking very well about Wingate. It was just too different to give him his just dues. Okay, next slide. So Burma became the birthplace of special operations. They did this indirect approach. It was a combination of land and air forces that is very difficult to do. It takes a lot of coordination, but it takes a lot of trust as well. And it takes a lot of training and a lot of communication going on. The resupply for a highly mobile combatant force is something that was well executed because of the leadership that we had in the 1st Air Commandos. The RAF liaisons knew how to talk to the pilots, knew how to communicate with them to the point where they could get what they needed. They were able to do surgical strike packages in close combat with the enemy. They were able to provide these strike packages. The emphasis throughout this whole thing was air logistics. And anybody who studies war says logistics sometimes takes a backseat to kinetics, but most historians believe that logistics is how you win a war. Intelligence was absolutely important. Communication, you can't say enough about that. And then the ability to immediately respond, to be on the balls of your feet, waiting for someone to call for help. Next slide. So the legacy, what came out of this? Well, first of all, the 1st Air Commandos were decommissioned in 1945. After all of these things that they've done, the legacy that they've provided, special ops units, expanding the air logistics role in theater operations, base opening templates. The base opening templates that were used here in the 1st Air Commandos, I was asked to provide my book to a general who was setting up bases in Iraq. And he used some of the information that was there. How do you go about doing that? How do you determine what you need in the way of a compact base opening without needing all of the support that everybody typically needs? Light plane operations, Rick, I think you said it best in yours. They never got the kind of support that they should have, but we see here that they were absolutely essential. The night gunship tactics that were set up by the B-25s, and that actually carries over later on in operations beyond 1944. Night operations were something that they were able to do, and you see that now in NVGs that we use all the time for special operations. The P-51s found out that Wright Field was coming up with a way to do rockets, and so they asked for, got some rockets, and used them to great effect, particularly when attacking Japanese airfields. Close air support, the helicopter technology, the equipment that they came up with, these snatch reels there's a kind of funny story. I will tell it now. That they were looking at this snatch capability, and the guy who was responsible, the guy from DuPont, said, "You know, I think you could actually get a downed airman and pick him up using this same procedure." And everybody went, "No, we're not doing that." So he actually did it. I have photographs in my book where this guy actually set himself up to be. But before that, they decided, well, we'll try it with a training glider, the TG5. We'll put the inertial reel inside the TG5. We'll put the hook on the outside, and we'll attach a sheep to this harness, and we'll see if we can do this. And they come in with the TG5. They hit that loop. They picked up that sheep. They reeled him in. They said, well, how was the sheep when he got there? Sheep's doing fine, but he sure is wide-eyed. So it actually could have worked. And we've seen the Fulton recovery system is somewhat of an offshoot of that. It's the same sort of principle, being able to pick somebody up and bring them into an airplane without landing. So those are some of the things that they were doing. They did some strange stuff. They got 450 feet of cable that they attached to the hard points on a P-51. They put a weight halfway around it so that when they took off, this thing dangled behind the P-51. They would go look for telephone lines and telegraph lines, and they would fly low over it, wrap that weight around the telephone lines and telephone poles, and they would snap the lines. There were a few instances where they actually pulled up the telephone poles, but they were able to jettison the cables and fly on. So they were willing to try anything. And it's just a marvelous unit in that they were mission oriented to a degree that's rarely seen. Okay.
It sounds like they were because they were kind of under the radar, they got to just try things and do things and you know, without too much oversight saying, you know, you can't do that, you can't do this. They're like, well, we got to do something, so let's try it.
Truth to that, Leah, that they were operating as Project 9. They actually went through a number of different iterations. Project 9 was what Arnold officially called them when he set them up. They also were called CA-281, which is really a misnomer. What happened is Cochran and Allison set up their offices in the Hay Adams Hotel in room 281. And so when they called somebody forward, they said, well, where do we go to interview? And they said, come to CA-281. It became kind of a name of the unit. They then became a provisional unit, the 53 18th. Then they were known as the number 1 Air Commando Force. And finally, the U.S. formally designated them the 1st Air Commando Group. But they had so much freedom in what they were doing. They would requisition almost anything. And because Arnold was supporting it, and because Arnold had seen other projects fail because they weren't getting support, anything that they asked for, they got. That included personnel that they wanted. So, yeah. Next slide. This is my dad. By the time he was 25, he had already been through Burma, and he came home. He was a very gentle man. I think he was a very wise man. He very rarely spoke, but when he did, you listened to him. And he taught my brothers and I the values that he had, and I'm just proud of him.
That's amazing. Did he share a lot of these stories? How did you gather all? I mean, this is tons of information. This sounds like you've interviewed so many people. You know, this is like 1,000 campfire stories just streamed together.
In some cases, they were almost like campfire stories. He very rarely talked about his operations in Burma. We found out a few things, but in the most part, he didn't. you had to get them with somebody else who had been there, and then they would start spinning stories. So while I was doing the research on this, I went to a First Air Commando Association meeting, and I sat down with the guys with a tape recorder, with a video recorder, and I asked them questions, and they began to tell stories, marvelous stories. And so I was able to incorporate those. Yet you have to verify what they're saying, because some of them are almost unbelievable. The story about the sheep was one that I got it verified from several different people. And so when I took the research to the First Air Commando Association, it was really kind of interesting, because I took it to them and I talked to General Allison, and I gave him a copy, and he read it, and he read it very quickly. Now, understand it's fairly short. And he called me back into his hotel room, and he said, I read your book, and he said, I learned some things out of this as well. He said, I knew tactically what we were supposed to do, but the strategic side of this, the fact that we were trying to hold 25 divisions in China by doing this, he said, I was never told that. And so I felt vindicated in finding out that kind of information. And then when you went to the transporters and the light plane, they all talked positively about each other. It was a brotherhood, literally a brotherhood. They didn't know what each other was doing at times. In fact, there were two locations that they flew out of, Holokandi and a place called Lalagat, and the fighters and the bombers were in one place and the transporters were in another. But they formed this camaraderie, not only amongst themselves but amongst the Chindits. That the Chindits came to their reunions as well, and so I got to talk to some of the Chindits and found out some things about them as well. So it was literally a labor of love. I enjoyed doing it. I felt good about doing it. After I gave them my first draft, they did say, we were supposed to be there for 6 months, but we stayed a little longer. So there's more to the story.
Ralph, one of the questions we got after the last one, and I'll just let you address it, is people ask about the vertical stripes on the airplane, how that came.
That's kind of an interesting story, because there's a lot of different ideas about it. There were 5 stripes. What I was told initially was the reason that they put the stripes on there was because they wanted to know, was this a Japanese airplane or was it us? And so it was to identify friend or foe. But then we asked, well, what were the 5 stripes for? And they said, some people said, well, there were 5 sections. Okay, there was the light plane, the transports, the gliders, the P-51s, and the bombers. But then one guy said to me, actually, it's Project 9. And I said, And he said, yeah, 5 stripes, and the intermediate is 9. So take your pick. You can have any one of those ideas.
It's no official ruling on that one yet. We might find out later. Rick, your group, your CAF unit is restoring an L5 right now. Do you want to tell a little bit about that aircraft and why you chose that story?
Let me tell you a quick deal. Our unit is located in Milton, Florida. So we're surrounded by Eglin Air Force Base, Hurlburt Field, and NAS Pensacola. However, despite our group being small, we're lucky. We have one member, Dan Jackson, who the Air Force is sending to get a PhD. He will teach World War II history at the Academy. We have a lieutenant colonel who flew for AFSOC, which is the Air Force Special Operations Command, which is kind of the lineage of the Air Commandos. All companies in the military love acronyms. So he has flown all kinds of crazy things that we didn't even know the military had. So it's good having him. And we also have Major General Clay McCutcheon, who is retired. He flew for AFSOC. He also was an Air Force historian, and he has 2 distinguished flying cross. Now, sometimes I tell people that, and they get a little intimidated. Let's say our lieutenant colonel last year flew his L4, which is a Piper Cub to Oshkosh, making 14 stops round trip. So I tell people, they're really good at what they do. But because of that, we wanted to, and everybody seems to find it quite fascinating about the lineage of the first Air Commando, which of course our airplane will be to honor the people who actually were there in that theater. Now I also want to talk real quick to the Gulf Coast Wing, which has a C-47 that will be configured to a C-47 Spooky specs. So the AFSOC now operates the C-130 gunships, some average C-130s, some Ospreys, and Dornier turboprops, all kinds of things. They are based at Hurlburt Field. So anybody also who would like to donate to either of these projects, then go to the CAF if you want to donate any money. Or if you ever want to come visit, obviously the West Houston Squadron's in Houston, and we're in Milton. We'd love to have you. We'd love anybody who would like to assist with the donations. That's fine. If you put down it's for the airplane, it won't be used for anything but the airplane. But, listening to Ralph talk, and his book is wonderful. Like I said, we have the gentleman that's going to the Air Force. He's written a few books about the Chinese in World War II. And having, the other folks, we decided that this is Ralph and I talked earlier, if it wasn't for the Flying Tigers, a lot of people would not really know anything about the China-Burma-India theater. So it's just fascinating, all the things they did. It's fascinating the fact that we discussed before, for instance, Jackie Coogan was a member. He played Uncle Fester. He was one of the people in the first Air Commandos. It's just interesting, as Ralph brought up to you, watch some of these modern kind of B movies where you see the president or the head of the CIA says, you don't have any rules, go out and do what you want to do. Well, this was kind of one of those deals, as Ralph brought up. He said, we just need results. We're not going to worry about the officers separated from the enlisted guys. We just need to get this done. And it's absolutely amazing what they got done. Like I said, so, look it up on the CAF website. You can look at both those units to see about, the AC-47 kind of became famous because of the Green Berets movie when John Wayne's quote, those people have it, not us. But all this is the lineage of what was started with the first Air Command. It's absolutely fascinating to me.
Well, we've gone over time a little bit, and our audience has hung in the whole time. So thank you everyone for staying with us a little bit late, but these were really fascinating stories. I've not heard like any of them, so this is amazing. Ralph, we're going to take your slide that lists the aircraft being used, and somehow we'll create a CAF air show based on having all the aircraft there. I like that idea a lot. Ralph's book is available on Amazon. You can find it pretty easily. It looks like you only have 3 left in stock, but there's more on the way, so just be patient. Amazon will pick up that order, I'm sure. So thank you both so much for this incredible information. I'd like to tell our audience we love hearing from you. If you want to give us any feedback, share your comments. If you have ideas for more episodes, please drop me a line. My email is media@cafhq.org. And we'll see you guys next week. So thanks a lot.